Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Tony Blair Institute, for those of you who are guests. My name is Ian Mulhern, and I'm Executive Director of Renewing the Centre here at TBI. And I'm delighted to welcome you all and those of you joining on our live stream to this sort of lunchtime-ish special event. And we're delighted to be hearing from Professor Robert Shiller about his new book, Narrative Economics. Now, Professor Shiller will be known to many of you as one of the most influential thinkers in the world. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2013 for his work showing how the value of asset prices fluctuates, reflecting the often irrational beliefs of investors about their future path. He will also be known perhaps more popularly for his work on irrational exuberance in the run-up to the dot-com bubble and his warnings ahead of the financial crisis too. And he's the author of a number of important books, including Irrational Exuberance itself, Fishing for Fools, and Animal Spirits. But he's also been a very practical commentator over many years, contributing lots of practical insights, including the Case-Shiller Housing Index in the US, which is the first of its kind, and also lots of practical policy prescriptions, such as ways to insulate households from the vicissitudes of the housing market and to use finance to really benefit people in their everyday lives. And also concepts like financial valuation, like the CAPE measure and things like that. So he's someone who has a broad sweeper, takes a broad view of what economics should be and the influences, what the influences on it should be, but is also really the think tank's kind of economist, really, in his practical application of those ideas. So his latest book, Narrative Economics, is out, I think, officially on the 1st of October, and it's in some good bookshops now. We've been in all of them come October, as I understand it. He's going to be shedding light. He sheds light in the book on some issues that economists tend to ignore, really, and about the power of stories to cause economic outcomes, and indeed broader political and social outcomes. And it's kind of timely as we worry about no deal and panic buying and things like that we might tackle some of these questions about what narrative economics is, what it means, and how it might lead us to improve policy making. So we're going to hear from Bob for about half an hour or so. He's going to take us through some slides, and then we'll open it up to questions and get a good discussion going. But Bob, welcome, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Maybe I'll stand up for this
Sure.
so that I don't block your view. I'm right in front of the screen. So this grew out of my presidential address at the American Economic Association 2 years ago. I looked at other presidential addresses, and I was surprised how many times they are critical of their own profession, in front of their own profession. But I'm not that critical. I'm suggesting things that economists don't do that they could do. And I'm thinking that we're undergoing a change now that will lead to a different kind of economics that is more respectful of human nature. So let me see. So I'm going to talk about what I mean by narrative economics, and then talk about medical epidemiology, which I think provides a model for ideas going. You saw it in the title of my book. Stories go viral and drive economic events. Stories like Brexit or Donald Trump or other stories which have a surprising life because of contagion. And so I want to learn from the medical people. And the theme here is that economic narratives are stories that are contagious and that affect human judgments about economic decisions. But that what was I just lost my train of thought. The economics narratives are like diseases, like influenza, for example. It's an awful way to do this, to say this, but I do think they're contagious and they follow epidemic models, and then they die out eventually. as happens with disease epidemic, unless there's a mutation or an environmental change. So influenza is not one disease. It's many diseases with a similar structure. Same way we'll see perennial narratives. So I'm going to come then to some examples. I'm not going to cover all 9 here. I gave 9 examples of perennial narrative, which, like influenza, keep coming back. That is a concept that is, I think, totally absent from the economics literature. There is something in the literature department that will talk about basic stories. There are people who write, like Andrew Tobias wrote the 7 fundamental stories for all literature. It's controversial, but I'm onto that wavelength here. And then talk about the future, which I think is something that I don't control and own, but I'm predicting that there will be more attention to this. So that's my book. The difference between behavioral economics and narrative economics. Behavioral economics is about psychology. It has a method adopted from, typically, most of the time, method adopted from the psychology department. Am I blocking you? And the methods are experimentation and observation, looking for principles of human nature that are stable through time. Whereas narrative economics is studying something different. It's studying this whole array of narratives that recur. And it's more like entomology that classifies different kinds of insects. Okay, you list all the different species. So it's a different approach to economics. So Palgrave's Dictionary of Political Economy in 1894 does mention narrative economics, but it meant something different. Narrative economics in 1894 was economists writing narratives about financial crises or chronologies. What I'm talking about is not writing chronologies about economic events. It's about writing about the popular narratives that the general public thinks. The idea is that economic behavior is not constant through time. It's shaped by ideas. And the way ideas spread is through, among the general population. Forget economists. We're talking about real people who make the decisions. They tell stories. So, for example, criminology is well aware of this. One criminologist was saying that trying to understand how criminals think. That's part of what. So he visits a jail or prison and has the opportunity to interview prisoners. So he tries out at first. He asks the prisoner, "What is your philosophy of life?" And gets a blank answer. They're not articulate. They can't describe their philosophy of life. They're just not thinking in those terms. But a better way is to say, "Hey, that prisoner over there, what's he in for?" And then they love to tell. They know every prisoner's story. And when you listen to his story, it's a human story. You detect morals. The prisoners they don't think that they're bad people. They think that they're moral people operating in a difficult world. So that's how ideas about economics spread among the general population. And some narratives occur in constellations. That is, people love to hear about Boris Johnson because they're all interested in Boris Johnson. So there's a whole array of Boris Johnson narratives. I'm also thinking of Donald Trump, that I'll come back to. You've probably heard some of that, even though it's not your president. So actually what I'm arguing for here is for taking account of the understanding about narratives that occurs in other social sciences. So what I'm doing is not very interesting to some reporters who think about narratives all the time. When they bring in an economist, they expect us to be quoting statistics about GDP or something, and not about what somebody said the other day. But actually, what I did using JSTOR, search for the word narrative in scholarly journals. And the black bars is the percent of articles, scholarly articles with the word narrative in it by field, all the way back to the beginning of these journals. And the bluish line, the light line, is in the last decade. So you can see two things. First of all, finance is the worst in terms of mentioning narratives. They do, though, not much. And economics is the second worst. Also, every single field is growing in their attention to narratives. This is as percent of the articles, so it's not affected by the size of the literature. And I think that, I think that has partly to do with the availability of data in terms of digitized text and ability to search and do natural language processing. I think it is a revolution that's starting. A profession depends on data, and the data available. In 1930s, in the Great Depression, we got the first data on unemployment rates, GDP, stock price index. Well, they were a little earlier, but the data change, and we change in response. That's a healthy response to the data. Also, I wanted to say that I called my book An Adventure in Consilience. I took a little worried about that someone might make fun of this, but maybe you don't know what consilience is. The term consilience was coined by William Whewell, who was a professor at Trinity College, Cambridge, in the 1740s, or thereabouts. It means the unity of knowledge. He was a philosopher of science. E.O. Wilson, a biologist, wrote a book called Consilience in 1998, which influenced me, saying that you can't, professions tend to home in on a certain methodology, and it becomes narrow with time, and they don't see all the ramifications. They have to be listening to other fields. So I ended up studying reading literature, a lot of literature, like, for example, the medical literature. So I think that we have to think of ideas as, in many cases, epidemics. So this is an actual epidemic. This is the Ebola virus, a single outbreak of the Ebola virus. It's not everywhere, you know, it's certain places where for some reason the environment suddenly changed and favored Ebola contagion. Or I don't think it was maybe it was a mutation in the disease. But in Lofa County, Liberia, these are weak numbers, the epidemic was growing, and then it comes down and disappears. Now, this was partly due to Doctors Without Borders that came in and helped them. But even if they hadn't, it would still follow this trajectory. And that's what epidemiology studies. So I'm going to apply that to economics. This is a couple of epidemics that you may have heard of. First one is bimetallism. It follows, it looks like an epidemic curve. So it started out in the 1870s, and it was just growing. It wasn't weeks, it was years. But in 1894, there was a London conference on bimetallism. You can read it, it's on the web, their conclusions. But it was biggest, I think, in the United States. And then it faded away. And what is bimetallism, by the way? You don't need to know that. But it is a theory that there should be two coins, silver and gold, whereas the pound sterling at this time was just gold, although they had subsidiary coinage. That's not, the point is it's an epidemic. And if you go back and read newspapers at that time, some people observed everybody's talking about bimetallism. And it was they were accused of stupidity. They were insulting each other. It was a polarization of society along this. You might find that hard to imagine. But it looks like the polarization we are observing with Brexit today. And it was geographical. In the United States, it was the rural areas. And the cities were all for the gold standard. Coming out, again, we come to Bitcoin. It looks to me just like bimetallism repeated. It's both about the money supply. It's both supposedly a resoundingly good idea that you'll never understand unless you're a young person today. And everyone, you've noticed this, right? There's lots of technical innovations, but something went viral on this one. It had something to do with the story. Satoshi Nakamoto supposedly invented this, but nobody can find him. What a neat story. And it keeps coming up with imposters claiming to be him. And it has other kind of appeal, which I could talk about. So this is I'm going to have to not spend much time. This is the most famous original epidemic model by Kermack and McKendrick in 1927. And it led to a literature almost 100 years about, there's many variations on this model. But it's called a compartmental model. There's 3 compartments: susceptibles, infectives, that's I, and recovereds, R. And in this story I'm telling, this disease is never fatal. You become immune for life after you've had it. And basically, I just quote all 3 of these compartments sum to 1. I have it N, but maybe just make 100%. Look at the middle equation. The change in the number of infectives. Maybe I should stand over here maybe this is better. Because you're just, I'm optimizing here. Is equal to a contagion rate, C times S, times the I, minus R times I. So CS has to be greater than R for the epidemic to grow. The contagion rate has to be above the recovery rate. You get, this is a solution for certain initial conditions that I picked here. There's 1 million people, 1 of them is infected, and the number of infectives goes through this curve, which is called the epidemic curve. But that's what we saw with Ebola. It rises for a while, and as the number of this is the number of susceptibles. It goes down, and the number of recovereds goes up, and eventually in this case, it asymptotes to 0. But what the real lesson is, you see these outbreaks like in Lofa County, Liberia, and you know, why is it happening here? You know, it had many opportunities to have an epidemic, and suddenly it did. It has something to do with contagion and recovery, but probably there was something that made it contagious at that time in that county. So then the question, economists look at narratives and think that they're meaningless. They're just talk. We talk about real economic forces like depletion of natural resources, technological progress, also stupid things central bankers do, mistakes by the government, but never about these narratives. But I'm saying there is a literature outside of economics that shows that narratives actually feed back into human decision. There's a causal impact. And I won't go through all these in the interest of time. But we know that people are not immune. They'll hear a story about some charismatic person, and they'll just imitate it, even subconsciously. It ends up affecting their behavior. So, and they occur in constellations. I've already said that. Donald J. Trump, to me, is an amazingly brilliant constellation. When I come home from work, I talk to my wife, I say, what's the news? What did Donald Trump say today? It's in the head of the news every day. So he has somehow really attracted attention. But economic models go through the same epidemic curve. So here's 4 economic models. The ISLM model, they're old, I had to take old models because I wanted to see the whole epidemic curve. ISLM model, real business cycle model, overlapping generations model, multiplier accelerator models. Well, there's a lot of jaggedness in here, but the overall pattern is a hump shape. So do I have, economists talk, I'm sorry, I won't go through this much, but one of those models is the multiplier accelerator model from Keynes, and as that adapted by Samuelson, and it yields hump-shaped patterns in a different way through feedback. When something shocks the economy, like government expenditure, then consumers start spending more, and businesses start investing more to accommodate the demand, and the economy grows for a while, and then it flattens out at a higher level because of the new stimulus. But I think that we need to modify these models to take account of the other feedback that's occurring through epidemics. So an example is the Laffer Curve. I think that had, some of you might not remember this, but if you're in my generation, you remember it. In 1978, Arthur Laffer drew this curve at dinner on a napkin, and this curve was taken to justify cutting government tax rates, saying it won't affect revenue because it will stimulate the economy so much that you'll end up with higher revenue with lower taxes. It was a story that went viral starting in well, I have a curve for it. It's going viral again. This is a perennial narrative. Nobody ever said Laffer Curve until it appeared in a book by Jude Wanniski in 1978. Then it just soared, and Margaret Thatcher got elected, or became, how do you say it, prime minister on cutting taxes. And then around here, Ronald Reagan got elected. It's not just this narrative, but this was a prominent one in a constellation of narratives. And then it died out as a curve. But now here something happened, and it's going epidemic again. Why should it do that? Well, I think we have to think like epidemiologists. We can't think like traditional economists who don't even look at plots like this. I have two books and news and newspapers. Both of them follow roughly similar patterns. And here's famous economists. They're all the epidemic. Now, I could be wrong that it's not simple contagion, but I think I'm not. They're all epidemic curves. This is depressing to young people who imagine that you will be eternally famous someday for your work. The best you can hope for is that your fame will outlive you, but it will eventually collapse. Some lucky people, Karl Marx, the communist, wasn't that famous. I didn't put it up here. I didn't want to get too political. He died in 1881. He wasn't that famous. He peaked in the 1970s. So that's the best you could hope for. So I have a list in my book of 9 important perennial economic narratives. And I'll just go through the first few and then we'll stop. This is the panic narrative. So I've got a number of panics. The Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857. These are all financial panic. They're all bank runs, really. People rushing to pull their money out of the bank because they heard the bank would fail. Panic of 1873, Panic of 1893, Panic of 1907. Now the interesting, each is shown separately, but you notice that as a group, they're all going through the hump-shaped pattern together. So this is 1837. No mention of the Panic of 1837 and 1837. They didn't think that way. In fact, if you look at the counts, it was more describing the banks of having made mistakes, or the president had made a mistake in shutting down the Second Bank of the United States. They tend to concentrate on what the politicians said. But you can see that the Panic of 1837, which is a heavy line, started growing at the same. It's at the same time as other panics. People were talking about the Panic of 1837 the most in 1907. And then it just faded. There was a huge panic, banking panic in 1933, but they didn't call it that. Now the words matter. You might say it's just words. Maybe they had some other way. But my reading is they were becoming more psychologically aware. The word panic suggests a psychological state. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, not every single time, but back here, you didn't go running to your bank because you wanted to be the first to pull your money out before the panic got further away, because people didn't talk about that. So you did have bank failures, but it wasn't quite the same. Anyway, maybe I'll move ahead because I want to stay within a half hour. I can. Also, the words describing confidence started to build. There wasn't much talk about these different terms until well into the 1850s in the English language literature. And then it went up and it peaked around 1907 again, a little bit after, and then it's been declining, financial panic. But business confidence came later. And then consumer confidence came later still. So now the most cited confidence indexes are consumer confidence. We're thinking that consumers will stop buying and will cause a recession. They didn't talk about recessions until 1938. But now we're thinking about buyers pulling out because they've lost confidence. These are models of the economy that the public has. It doesn't matter what we academics say. Another model of the economy is the model of the Great Depression of the 1930s, starting with the 1929 stock market crash. Everybody still knows that. The 1907 panic, I bet not more than 1% could identify that there was even a panic in 1907. But the story of the Great Depression was a turning point. But the interesting thing is, they didn't talk much about the Great Depression in the Great Depression, even though Lionel Robbins wrote a book in 1934 called The Great Depression. He was somewhere in the UK, right? He was LSE maybe? He was, am I right? Okay. So you can see that the Great Depression was growing for 50 years. This reflects an underlying truth about epidemics. There are both slow epidemics and fast epidemics. Ebola tends to go fast in a particular place. But AIDS is a very slow epidemic because contagion isn't that high, but it lasts. The recovery rate is very low. So it depends on those two parameters if you stick with that simple model. So the Great Depression was growing, and then suddenly, this data set for books stops in 2008, but just the wrong time to stop. But this News and Newspapers source shows the incredible spiking of Great Depression. People thought suddenly this latent narrative of the Great Depression came back, and they thought we are really repeating the Great Depression. Now, another of my perennial narratives is it's opposed. There are frugality narratives and modesty narratives, and there are conspicuous consumption narratives. So leading in the US at the present time is a conspicuous consumption narrative, which is peculiarly American and has led to our Donald Trump president, and also to one of the strongest economies outside of Asia until maybe just now. So he doesn't write books, he hires people to write books. And Meredith McIver is writing, but she's good. Nobody could do, this is Donald Trump type words. She interviewed him, she knows what he's thinking. So I find it amazing he would talk like this. So he assumed you want to learn to think like a billionaire, right? So he asks you, it takes practice. Can you confidently name the top 5 jewelers in the world? Can anyone name them? See, this is why you're not a success. You haven't adopted this mentality. And so he has a chapter on dress, and he tells you what's really good. This is your route to success. I couldn't believe he talks about the best cufflinks. Okay, the best cufflinks are the Trump 5-star diamond cufflink. There they are. You want to run out and buy these so you can be a success. I keep some on hand to give to people as gifts, and they are great looking. I also wear solid gold cufflinks from time to time. Of course, that's what we're doing. That's not good enough. It has to be Donald Trump cufflinks. He's apologizing that they're not solid gold. But I don't know how to prove that this is affecting American thinking. But I think it's affecting not just the billionaires, it's affecting people at lower rungs on the social ladder who feel that they have to keep up appearances. I'm going to contrast that with Winifred Holtby. Does anyone know who she is? See, you should be remembering her rather than Donald Trump. She was a columnist in the 1930s for the Manchester Guardian. It used to be called the Manchester Guardian. She's talking about life in the Great Depression and saying that, you know, we don't really have to spend so much money. We can live. Can we not use this period, the Depression, to get rid of a little snobbery and bunkum and live lives dictated by our own taste instead of our neighbors' supposed notions of what is done? With so much to do in a world so rich in experience, must we shut ourselves up into little genteel compartments in which we all adopt the same arbitrary standards, wear the same things, eat the same things, and produce the same sad monotony of appearances? Reading people like her, and they tend to be women, I think. Maybe that's a bad generalization, but maybe they were. I think that maybe the Depression was a better time to be alive than the Roaring '20s that preceded it. Another woman said, you know, people are just nicer now in the Depression. They're forgiving. People give money to beggars on the street, and they used to consider that they were professional beggars and wouldn't do it. Here's the American dream. Have you heard of the American dream? What is it? Well, it's something like it's okay to be rich because everyone else has equal opportunity, and they'll be inspired if they see you with your gigantic house. Oh, and then monetary. This is coming back. I better wrap up here, but this is. Why did people get so excited about bimetallism? Well, one thing, there was a spinner of narratives, William Hope Harvey, who wrote a book, Coins Financial School, which you own. You just take your cell phone and search for that, and it's past its copyright, and you can read it. It's like a comic book. It's about bimetallism. And this boy, he's a boy, is lecturing to business people and about the advantages of bimetallism. And they think he's an upstart, and what's this boy talking? I don't know why he's talking to them, but and they would raise objections, and he would always outsmart them. And why did this sell 1 million copies? You know, I think it's these rural people out there in the countryside felt ashamed of themselves or something that they weren't. It was a depression. They were having hard times. And they read this comic book story about fooling or showing up these people. It somehow went viral. And that accounts for bimetallism. Technological unemployment is another theme about labor-saving machinery stealing jobs. I just gave someone told me it goes back to Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I made a statement that technological unemployment is damaging low-income people. So it goes at least that far back. But it shot up in the Great Depression. You know what I'm referring to. But they had a different word for it. They used to say labor-saving machinery is replacing human jobs. Then they called it technological unemployment. So it looks like a new name for something. It makes it more viral. And people thought, a lot of people thought in the Great Depression that the Great Depression, high unemployment, was caused by robots that were coming in. They called them robots. Already, how could they think that in the 30s? Well, you have to go back and read what they were saying. So let me give you one example. This is Albert Einstein. You've heard of him. He has a strong narrative that is going on today, much more than any other physicist. And it's because he said colorful things. Like he said about, he would opine on the Great Depression. So he said this in 1933. According to my conviction, it cannot be doubted that the severe economic depression is to be traced for the most part to internal economic causes. The improvement in the apparatus of production through technical invention and organization has decreased the need for human labor and thereby caused the elimination of a part of the labor from the economic circuit and thereby caused a progressive decrease in the purchasing power of a dollar of the consumers. We don't even, that's not part of the narrative today at all about the Depression. It's most commonly a confidence narrative. But this is a plausible cause, at least part of the cause of the Great Depression. If people thought that they were going to be replaced by a machine, they might be more cautious about spending money. So this is my last slide. I think that narrative economics is not mine. I just wrote a book with that title, but I think it's already happening. People are already doing research that uses digitized text. The new technology is also changing the parameters, the contagion and recovery parameters. We need to study that. I think there will be new forms of economic theory, like the Keynesian model. Keynes is almost a behavioral economist. I don't know about a narrative economist, sort of. Maybe he's a great story. But I think we have to combine models with epidemic models. And I think we should be collecting better data on economic narratives now, organizing it so it can be available in the future. I'll stop with that.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Bob. Okay, before we open it out to a bit more of a broader discussion, now, I wondered if I could push you a bit on the implications for sort of policy and what you kind of see as, well, how you hope this agenda might be progressed, because I guess that you could see the idea of being aware of the impact of narratives and their importance as just something that's useful for economists to be more aware of. But you could go all the way to the other extreme of saying, if we could sort of build this into our forecast better, maybe there's something we can.
Well, one thing is we can forecast better.
Yeah.
So I don't mean to boast, but I did say in a book that came out in 2000 that I thought the stock market was vulnerable and a recession could occur. And then in the second edition, I forecasted the financial crisis. Not exactly, I didn't say the most confident forecast, but I said widespread bank failures is a serious possibility coming soon.
Yeah.
And what did I base that on? I had no model. And I don't take this as evidence. To me, it's evidence that I know. What was I basing? I was basing it on the crazy narratives about real estate that I was hearing.
But is your hope that it's an informal sense in which people have an idea about the importance of narrative and they use that to say, look, on balance, it looks like the stock market is vulnerable? Or is your hope that quantitatively you can embed this into?
Yeah, one thing about we can do the same models that epidemiologists do, and that may help us forecast. Yeah. But I haven't really reached final conclusions about how to do that. So looking at the real estate market in the United States right now, I have not been making confident forecasts. But the real estate was going up it bottomed out after the financial crisis, according to our own indices in 2012. Then it started a rapid ascent at about 10 to 12% a year for a few years. And then it slowed down to 5% a year. And then it slowed down further to 3% a year with our latest data. This tends to be a hump-shaped pattern, and I don't have great confidence in it, but it's not like the stock market because it's not a liquid market and it doesn't allow, it's harder for smart money, hedge funds, to trade in and out of it, although they do. Yeah. But I'm thinking that maybe our forecast, I would like to keep it, if I were back, I used to forecast in the Wall Street Journal home prices for a while in the 1990s. But it was gotten too monotonous. We were always predicting increases. But if I were to get back into that, I would try to think about epidemiology of narratives. But it's a big project. I don't know how to do that. Yeah. Maybe someone else will do that.
Yeah, yeah. And it won't have escaped your notice coming to the UK this week of all weeks that there's a lot going on in British politics at the moment, and obviously lots of debate about whether we'll be facing a no-deal Brexit, and lots of questions floating around about how prepared are we for a no-deal Brexit? Can we ever be prepared? And I suppose one of the things that one can't, or it's harder to be prepared for, is what kind of narratives might starts to emerge that might cause people to panic, that might cause people to panic buy. So
but then the perennial narratives are there. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wonder what you think. If you're advising policymakers, is there something they can take from this kind of way of looking at the world that might help in planning for this?
Well, I'm worried that the next recession that we're talking about so much, now this is itself a narrative induced. I can talk about that. But it's also maybe a severe one because of the big attention that's being paid now to artificial intelligence. And I think young people today, maybe you can tell me I'm wrong, but young people today are worried about their long-term future. You're going to live to be 100 years old. And are you going to, somewhere along that time, be replaced by a machine like Queen Elizabeth I worried? I think it has the potential to come. That's what happened in the 1930s, that the technological unemployment narrative was already starting in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. And Stuart Chase wrote in 1929, I think, a book about technological unemployment, which was talked about a lot. So here we were in 1929, where there was great talk about the higher, they thought that they didn't publish unemployment rates regularly, but there was a government study that suggested that unemployment is higher than you'd think, even though we're prosperous. And so that led people to think that it was caused by technology advancing. And they had lots of narratives about what machines are doing now. They had conveyor belt assembly lines and automatic things happening already. And so when the unemployment went up in the Great Depression, a lot of people, not just Einstein, thought this is it. This is the major turning point that will be recorded by historians when the machines took over. Turns out they were wrong at that point of time. But the narrative is still there, and I don't know if any of you feel worried about this. We don't know what's coming next. They're talking about now having a hearing aid that you can put in your ear, and when someone speaks to you in a foreign language, it will automatically translate it into, it'll detect the language and translate it into English. You can walk anywhere in the world when this happens. You don't need to learn a foreign language. They'll have these too, and you just strike up a conversation with anybody. Things like that are coming, and I don't know if it scares you. Maybe it doesn't, and the reason it doesn't scare you is because nobody's talking about it now. But if it needs the contagion to get going. Once it gets going, then you will get scared about it. And then that's when this will be turning into a severe recession.
Yeah. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Tom, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I just have a quick question about how you establish whether a narrative has gone viral or not. A large amount of your data, especially historic data, is based on references in newspaper articles, which are, I mean, it's kind of no longer the case with social media, but historically have been controlled by a very small number of people. So how can you be sure that these narratives aren't simply impacting a tiny minority of the population who are the gateholders to the dispersion of information, and are actually affecting everyone in a way analogous to an epidemic?
Yeah, so that's an important question. And that's why, in the end, I want more data collected in the future. I'm limited by what is there, but I've already tried reading diaries. There are collections of personal diaries. So I was recently reading a 14-year-old girl's diary from the 1930s. I felt like I better stop. I'm intruding on her, but she's probably dead now, right? So I don't even know who she was. She wasn't very helpful. She did not have many economic narratives, even though it was the Depression. It was mostly about boys, by the way. But I think that we can, you can search diaries. They're not randomly selected diaries. It's the same problem. So I think that we could start a drive to collect. Does your grandmother leave behind a diary? If so, we'd like to scan it in. The other thing I've started looking at, but not too systematically, is church sermons. Because people are very influenced by religion, and maybe less so now, but they used to go to church. And I went to the Yale Divinity School and tried to get a librarian to help me find digitized church sermons. And they are available, but they seem to be in websites written for pastors who are about to write a sermon, and they can steal from another famous person's sermon. I don't want the famous preacher's sermon. I want to know what the everyday guy was. And I don't know if that is digitized and collected. So the other thing is focus groups. You have a skilled leader of a focus group will bring together people of a certain persuasion, or like truck drivers, and will pose trying to find out how they really think about something, but and getting them in a discussion. And this is an art, maybe. A lot of these things require human judgment. And this brings me back then to the literature departments of the universities of the world, which have a very different tool bag to explore ideas. But what is it about a successful novel or a successful story? We don't yet have ways to be precise. So we end up isolated in our departments and may miss some of the obvious things.
Okay. Yeah.
If it was very interesting, I'm Max from the technology team.
From what team?
The technology team.
Yeah.
So you made me think about like the anti-vaxxer discussions online.
Right.
Measles outbreaks.
And they've spread around the world.
Yeah, and it's just, I was just thinking, what are the capacity of kind of individuals and policymakers and governments to change those contagion rates in a way they might not have done in the future? So YouTube changes algorithms and potentially get in the way of some of those kind of narrative features.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I don't claim to have
Sorry, just for the benefit of the people on the live stream, the question was, what's the capacity of government to affect those contagion rates of ideas, right?
I was thinking that some government intervention in publications has been around for thousands of years. And what comes to my mind is the libel or character assassination. If you make up lies about someone and impugn their character, they can sue you for that. And that's usually a civil trial, and you would get damages. But I don't know if we have a public, if that, it's kind of necessary because people do that, and it ruins people's lives. But if we've been able to do that, it doesn't seem to be misused that much. I don't know, I'm not an expert in the law. We can do something like that on the public, for the public interest. If someone incites, I wonder why Hillary Clinton didn't sue Donald Trump for calling her Crooked Hillary or the Clinton crime family with no evidence. Maybe she should have sued him. She decided not to, so nobody does anything about it. I still don't know that I have answers to your questions.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm Sam. I'm work on counter-extremism here at the Institute, and we do a lot of work on narratives of the non-violent extremist sites show that they're dangerous in the context of the UK. And also sort of outside of the Institute, I look at narratives in the context of foreign policy and how the UK and the EU talk about different aspects of foreign policy.
Oh, so I'm interested to know how you do this, but...
Absolutely. But one of the things that I'm interested in is using narratives as a tool, and particularly in economics. Where do you see narratives as putting public pressure on policy, or policy and responding to narratives, or the other way around?
Well, it goes both ways.
Policy goes first and then the narrative responds. So one example I would think of would be in the Euro crisis, how does Germany's conception of frugality as a dominant economic narrative drive their response to, in European Council, to the Greek crisis, for example?
Right. Oh, now the Greek crisis is an interesting narrative event. I'm talking about was it 2009? There were protests against, Greek government was facing a budget problem. And so they were talking about raising the retirement age. And retirement age differs by occupation. It did in Greece. But some people, like hairdressers, were allowed to retire at age, I think it was 55, for their health, because they inhale fumes from the chemicals they put on people's hair. And that became a story that was very popular in Northern Europe about those southern, I won't say what the prejudice is about, but it sounds very Greek to them that you would be complaining about having to retire at age 57 instead of 50. You know, a lot of people are 57 and they're still quite capable of working. So that went viral. And it actually started to affect, it started to call the Greek debt into question. And then it fed the egos of people who think that we're more responsible. And it bled over to Italy and Spain, which were thought to be populated by similarly not reliable, responsible people. And then it exploded. It caused, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy again. So I don't know. How do you research these narratives?
So our most recent report took a 3-month sample of Twitter,
Okay.
4 groups, and coded that and compared it to a more extremist narrative.
So you are, that, I didn't mention that. The social media is another major source of digitized text. And you can search on Google Trends. That's the easiest thing to do.
Okay, take that question.
Well, I'm Mark. I'm an intern here, and I'm a public policy and geography student at the University of Chicago. First of all, I just want to say thank you for featuring Henry George.
Oh yeah, you probably never heard of Henry George, right? You like Henry George? He's a good writer.
Yeah. More people should read him. And then second, do you think, yes, I do, I've done a lot of research and papers on the sort of journey of housing into this financialized asset that we expect families to rely on for their fiscal future.
Right.
Do you think that governments and policymakers have a duty to steer people away from assets that are potentially more vulnerable to narrative than like things like the stock market, which you described as more stable?
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that in the early 1920s, there was a movement funded by some, I think, real estate people called the Own Your Own Home movement. And they ran ads in newspapers showing a picture of a home, and this is in the 20s. And it showed an argument that it's okay to borrow to buy a home. They were trying to educate the population out of its feeling that debt is bad, and responsible families would never go voluntarily in debt. Well, debt buying a house is the American. You couldn't say American dream yet. That wasn't that wasn't invented yet. But these ads have been continuing. There were other groups, so it was a big campaign to get people to accept taking out a mortgage to buy a home. And it's still recently going on. The National Association of Realtors in the U.S. has run ads advocating home ownership. So, and they're financially interested in this outcome. So the question is whether there should be something like campaign laws that we have for elections that would restrict this kind of public advertising. Again, I'm not advocating policies in this book. It's a project. This is too big for one man, too big a project.
But that's interesting because in some of your other books you talk about financial measures that can insulate people from the volatility of the housing market.
Right.
And here it's almost like it points in the direction of perhaps measures that dampen the narrative volatility of the housing market, which is perhaps the other half of the coin.
See, narratives are hard to predict. So we started a futures market for single-family homes at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, Case and I, and it's still going, but it's never gotten much. But it looked like it was taking off in the first year, and then it just faded.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's like trying to make a hit movie or a hit novel. Maybe our timing was off. We had the financial crisis, and that was the end of our not totally the end of the market. There's someone who's still trading there, and I'm not sure who they are or where they come from, but there are some.
Okay. Right, let's go time for one more. Dave?
Oh, thank you, Ian. David Rogers. Really interesting, thank you very much. A couple of questions from me. One, sorry if this is an oversimplified question, but how can we be sure where a narrative is driving behaviour rather than reflecting behaviour that would otherwise have been happening? And then second, perhaps relating that to one specific narrative, I wonder whether you've looked at climate change, which is something where there has been a preponderance of narratives over time, and it seems like at the moment there's a lot of effort going into affect contagion rates, particularly on climate change narratives. And
That's a good project. I haven't done that. One of my pro-Trump relatives sent me a newspaper article that he said was from the Washington Post 1922, which described climate change as if it was happening then. And I said, I don't believe this. It looks it's too close to what we're saying now. His point was that they said it back then and it didn't happen. So I looked it up, I found the article, and it had been doctored. It wasn't exactly, they made it, updated it a little bit. So having a serious study of climate. Now actually, the narratives about climate change going back 100 years tended more to be about exhaustion of natural petroleum. And there were oil price scares in the 20s, I think, and maybe also at other times. They thought we were about to run out. We've just invented the automobile, and there isn't that much oil. The whole thing is going to fail because we run out of oil. That turned out to be way off the mark. And so this also discredits people who talk about climate, because that is correct, that there was an oil price fear in the 1920s that turned out to be way premature. We have time.
And your other question was?
The other point was simple point narratives, driving behaviour.
Cool. Well, I had one slide on this where near the beginning, where am I? Oops, there it is. God. Yeah, there it is. We know that narratives, that narrative expositions of stories that involve human interest, that the person identifies with maybe, that have a visual image. I quote Cicero, the Roman senator from 2,000 years ago. He has a book on rhetoric, and he advises you about how to write. Cicero said, keep visual images in your speeches, because he said the mind is very attuned to visual images. And so some of these, the law one, that's the last that I have shown by Bell, they did a mock trial of a criminal where they had, I suppose, students pretending to be a jury. It wasn't a real trial. But they were presented evidence about the guiltiness of a certain accused. And they did it in two different ways. The evidence was presented in a bland way, and in the control group, and in the experimental group, they jived it up with just colorful details, so it was a nice story. So what sticks in my mind from the jazzed up version of the prosecution is they said the accused lunged at the victim, in the process knocking over a bowl of guacamole dip upside down on a white shag carpet. Okay, well, whether he knocked over the guacamole dip isn't relevant. They added that in the souped up version, and they found they were better able to get conviction. So they made it into a narrative instead of just a dry fact. Oh, and in journalism, Marcel Marquil, they wanted to present some evidence on air pollution. And so they had two different news stories for television. One of them was the news story just had a scientist quoting statistics about how air pollution is creating diseases. The other one, they forget the scientist. We go to a baker who has asthma, and he was suffering from asthma for years. And finally he got angry because these polluters were just not behaving well. And he made it his life's work to battle against these polluters. That was just remembered much more strongly than the scientists talking. They teach you this in journalism school. When you write newspaper articles, you don't start out with the facts. You start out with some story like that. And it's just human nature to remember that. So I take these things as examples that the creative element of a narrative is, the guacamole dip was a creative idea that the writer of the narrative had, and it made it work. Just as the napkin in the Art Laffer story made that work. So, so in a sense, it is an invention of sorts that often drives the economy, but it's an invention of creative spirits who tell stories. It can also be traditional economic causes too. I'm not ruling them out.
Good to know that we're not entirely redundant as economists just yet. Bob, it's just after 3, so it's time for us to call it to a halt. But thank you very much, and you've given us an awful lot to think about. Their narrative, something that I suppose in other walks of life people think about all the time, and economists generally try and ignore them. And
right, we're trained to ignore them.
Yes, exactly. But do read the book. It's full of fascinating examples and fresh thinking on how to approach some of these things. So thank you very much for coming and joining us, and thanks to all of you who joined us on live stream in the room today. Thanks very much.
Thank you.